Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Charlotte here, and today I have challenged myself to make a masculine card that has flowers on it. I'm using the Mandy's Flowers stamp set that came in the August Simon Says stamp card kit, and this is one of the videos where I'm trying to catch up on my card kits. I've been doing this with a few different ones recently. The June card kit was my most recent one, and I have a video coming soon with the July one, but I decided I would put this one first because this is also my design team project for the Watercooler Wednesday challenge starting today, which is a masculine themed challenge, hence trying to make a masculine card with this stamp set. So I'm starting off by stamping the kind of wreath onto a white card base. I'm just stamping it directly onto the card base, and this is going to be a 1-layer card. I stamped it with my favourite things, black licorice hybrid ink. This is alcohol marker friendly ink, it's also watercolour friendly ink, and it is my go-to black ink. It is the one I use most often. So I stamped the flower wreath down with that, and I double stamped it to make sure I got a nice crisp impression. And then I have taken a background stamp from my stash, and this is the Altenew wood palette background. This is actually my first time using it. This is a new one to me, and I'm going to stamp that onto the card base as well. I positioned the card base so it's not right in the corner, and I actually used some post-it tape to adhere it to the mat in my MISTI so that if I need to restamp it, I can make sure it's in exactly the right place. And I realised I need to make a mask for the flowers, so I just put the stamp onto an acrylic block, inked it up, and then pressed some post-it note onto it. I initially was just going to mask off the flowers and not bother masking the ring itself, which is why I first stamped it just the flowers onto a post-it note, but I actually decided to mask off the ring as well. So I just stamped those onto post-it notes and then fussy cut them out off screen and positioned them on top of the image to protect it from the stamping. Now I'm going to ink up my background now that my image is masked, and I am using Barely Beige ink, which is also by Simon Says Stamp, just inking all over the stamp to make sure I have good coverage. Again, I will stamp 2 or 3 times to make sure I get a nice crisp impression and to make sure the ink is as dark as I would like it to be. I did find there was one spot that wasn't stamping as well as I would have liked, and it wasn't until I went to remove the stamp after I'd finished all my stamping that I realised why. There was actually a slight air bubble under the stamp where it had picked up on the MISTI. So if you find you are having an issue with one spot not stamping properly, that's one thing to check for. If there is an air bubble, you just need to kind of peel up the corner nearest the bubble and let the air out and press the stamp back down, and then it should work fine. After I'd stamped the background, I pulled in a sentiment, which is also from the Mandy's Flowers stamp set, which says "for you" and fit very nicely in with this image in the centre of the wreath. And I'm stamping it with Paper Bag Ink from Altenew, which is a brown ink. I will then start on colouring the image, and if you would like to skip the colouring and just go straight to the finished card, I will have a number showing on screen now to show you where you can skip to. There will also be a time link in the description box, so you can just click the link directly and it will take you to the exact spot to skip the colouring. So I'm going to start off by colouring the ring of the wreath, and I decided to do it as a wooden ring, and you can see my phone on the left hand side of the screen, which I just found an image to use as an example. I just searched for masculine florals, and I'm using the picture I found as a colour guide for my flowers. You can see the caps of the pens I have used on screen, and I'm colouring with Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers, and I like to work, generally speaking, I'll put darkest to lightest, but with this ring I actually started with my lightest colour and laid that all the way around. I then put my mid-tone into the shadow areas and the darkest one into the very deepest shadow areas, and then I'm blending it out again with the mid-tone and then the lightest colour just to get a good transition. I will actually later go in and change the colour of this ring a bit because I found I didn't like how it was in comparison to the sentiment. The sentiment's more of a reddish brown, and the colour I have for the wreath at the moment is more on the yellow side of brown, so I will go in and fix that so they match a bit better later on. Next I'm going to move on to colouring the flower, and I think this is the very first time I have coloured a white flower. looking at the picture on my phone, there is a white flower in the background and it's got kind of greenish tones to it. So I tested out some colour ideas on a spare piece of paper, which is just off on the right hand side of the screen, and I decided to use a very light yellow green as my shadow colour, and I just laid that into all the shadow areas. I started with the 2 central petals, so I started by putting it in the centre. All the areas on the stamp where the shadows are already drawn in, or the folds, those will have shadows. So I put the yellow green colour down there, and then I went in with my mid-tone, which is eggshell, and used that just to blend the colour out a little bit. And then for my lightest colour, I'm not actually using a colour, I'm just using the colourless blender to help soften the edges of those shadow areas and blend them out to the white. One thing to remember when you are colouring anything that is white is that white objects will pick up the colours of what is around them. Anything will, really. If you think about, if you have a very strong light from a fire, for example, that will cast its colour, so with a fire, a kind of yellowy colour, onto whatever objects are around. But especially with white, if you're going to be colouring something white, you should try to take into account what the colours of things are around it and what colours they could be reflecting, for example. And also you can take into account what it's made of. So for example, recently I was colouring some snowmen, and as snowmen are quite cold, I use very pale blues for my shadows. Often if I colour a white animal, a unicorn for example, I will use pale greys as the shadows. I coloured a couple of months ago a bunny that was a lollipop or popsicle, and I gave that kind of creamy yellow tones as the shadows. So it really depends what you are colouring. I actually have been thinking about maybe doing a video showing different approaches for colouring white things depending on what they are. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, then do let me know in the comments below and I'll see about doing that perhaps. Okay, so having finished my flower and all the other petals were just done the same way as the first ones, I decided I would fix that ring as I mentioned. So I found a red brown and just went over the whole ring with the red brown to kind of tie it in with that sentiment colour a bit better. So just very carefully filling in that area. And alcohol markers tend to be quite easy to layer anyway, but especially when they're similar colours, so in this case they were all browns, it's fairly easy to layer them, so it's easy to correct that sort of mistake. Next I will colour my leaves, and again I tested off on my little piece of paper to the right hand side. It was off screen so I didn't show that, but I did play around and test to see what colour combination I wanted to use. And I settled on another yellow green as my darkest colour, but this one is darker than the one I used for the flower. And using yellow green here again helps tie the colours together and gives the colouring and the image a more cohesive look. For my mid-tone I'm using a citrus green, and I'm just flicking that in to kind of pull out the colour of the shadow areas, and so just bringing it out towards the lightest areas. And then my camera dies partway through the next bit, but I use a lighter colour, which is an even lighter citrus green, to finish off those leaves. I went with a darker green combination for those smaller leaves. I wanted them to be just very slightly different, but also not too obviously different, if that makes sense. I wanted them to be cohesive, but also be different. So then my final touch was to add shadows to everything, a drop shadow. And I'm putting this to the left hand side as if the light is coming from the top right, which is my usual way of doing my lighting. I'm just using a very light grey to add the drop shadow under everything. And then I will also go back in with a slightly darker grey just to darken it up in the areas that I think need more of a depth to the shading. And it's fairly easy to add the drop shadow once you've decided which direction your light is coming from. You just kind of follow the outline of the image. So I'm just drawing around the edge of the ring and drawing around the edge of the leaves and the flowers. I don't add much of a shadow, it's quite a little one. It just helps to add some dimension to the image. I then blended the shadow out with my blender pen, just very slightly to soften the edge there and make it look a bit more natural. You could leave it as a harsh edge, which would also work, it just gives a different look. I then decided I wanted to add the same shadowing to the letters. They just felt a bit flat otherwise compared to everything else. So again, I'm just following the edge of the letters with my light grey. and this is an ice grey, which is I think the lightest grey I have. And again, I'm going on the left hand side of all the lines here. I'm following the sentiment lines. And that completes my card. That's all the colouring done, and I thought about adding Nouveau drops but decided just to leave it as is. As I said, this is my design team project for Watercooler Wednesday's Masculine Challenge, so I will have a link to that down below. And I would love to know if you think I pulled off my challenge to myself of making a masculine card with flowers. Does this seem masculine to you? Would you be happy to give it to a man? I guess it depends who you are giving it to. If it's a man who likes flowers or is a gardener perhaps, then it could certainly be appropriate. Of course, different people like different things. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll hit the thumbs up button just to let YouTube and me know that you like my content and would like to see more of it. There are a couple more videos on screen that you might enjoy. I will link to one that shows some other creative ways to use florals, not necessarily masculine focused, but you might find them of interest, and I will link to another video as well. I hope you will subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!